The flood hurled a wooden skiff against the estate's lower steps hard enough to split its bow, and Margaret Hale ran into the rain before the people inside could be swept away. She caught the rope with both hands, her thin frame nearly dragged from the stones, then saw 6 exhausted villagers crouched in the leaking boat. One woman clutched an empty water jug. An older miller lay across the boards, his lips gray and his work shirt soaked through. Behind them, the entire valley had become a brown, moving lake. "The village well is fouled," the woman gasped. "The mill's under. Road bridge went an hour ago." Then she looked past Margaret toward the hilltop granaries and said the words that made the cold settle deeper. "Mr. Ashcombe's steward turned us away." Whatever mercy remained on that hill was locked behind 3 iron keys, and the man who owned them had sworn his grain would not be touched. Margaret looped the rope around an old hitching post and pulled until the skiff struck stone again. The abandoned kitchen stood 20 yards behind her, its chimney broken, its windows filmed with years of grease and neglect. That morning, it had been her punishment, a forgotten room given to a dismissed companion who had offended the mistress of the house by speaking too plainly. Now it was the only dry building near enough to receive the stranded. "Bring him inside," Margaret ordered. 2 villagers lifted the miller. Another stumbled after them carrying a sack that dripped river water. Margaret shoved the swollen kitchen door with her shoulder until it opened over the warped floor. The room smelled of wet ashes, mice, and rusted iron, but the great hearth was sound. A stack of split wood remained beneath a canvas sheet. Copper kettles hung blackened above the range. To some people, it would have looked ruined. To Margaret, it looked possible. She struck a match, built the fire low, and poured the last clean water from her own pitcher into the largest kettle. The woman with the jug watched every drop. "There are 43 adults still below," she said. "Some trapped in the chapel loft, others at the smithy. We have 2 boats, but no bread after tonight." Margaret's hands paused above the flame. 43 people. No mill. No road. No clean well. And uphill, behind walls the flood could not reach, stood Ashcombe's private granaries, enough wheat, oats, and dried beans to feed the village for months. You might think any decent man would have opened them at once, but pride can build a higher wall than stone, especially when a man has spent his whole life believing ownership is the same thing as virtue. Hoofbeats sounded beyond the rain. Margaret crossed to the doorway as estate owner Nathaniel Ashcombe rode down from the main house, dry beneath a heavy oilskin. His steward followed with a ledger tucked inside his coat. Both men stopped when they saw villagers crowding the abandoned kitchen. Ashcombe's gaze moved from the broken skiff to the fire burning in the hearth. "You were given this room for your own use," he said. Margaret stood in the doorway, rain running from her sleeves. "They have nowhere else. They're trespassing on private ground." Behind her, the miller began coughing so violently that the woman beside him cried out. Margaret did not move. "Then your private ground is where they will live," she said. The steward leaned toward Ashcombe and whispered something Margaret could not hear. Ashcombe looked uphill toward his granaries, then back at the flooded valley. Before he could answer, a bell began ringing below them. Not the chapel bell. The iron warning bell beside the river. 1 strike. 2. 3. A second surge was coming down from the mountains, and the remaining villagers had less than an hour to reach high ground. The warning bell kept striking as Margaret stepped out of the doorway and pointed toward the 2 skiffs. "Take every rope in this room," she said. "Tie 1 boat behind the other. Bring back those who can walk first, then the injured." The villagers stared at her as though authority required a title. Margaret seized a coil from beneath the kitchen table and thrust it into the miller's wife's hands. "You know the current better than I do." That was enough. The woman turned and began giving orders. Within minutes, 4 adults pushed the damaged skiff back into the flood while 2 estate laborers, drawn by the bell, lowered a narrow livestock boat from the upper pasture. Nathaniel Ashcombe watched from horseback until Margaret looked directly at him. "Your men know the safest channel," she said. "They are employed by this estate. Then employ them to keep your neighbors alive." His jaw tightened. For a moment, Margaret expected him to refuse simply because she had dared to speak before he had decided what was proper. Then another crash rolled up from the valley. Part of the riverside smithy folded into the water and vanished. Ashcombe turned in the saddle. "Caleb, take the north channel. Use the orchard wall as your marker." The steward protested. "Sir, the current could cost us both boats." "It could cost us people," Ashcombe said, though the words sounded unfamiliar in his mouth. The rescue ran until dusk. Boats returned carrying soaked farmers, shopkeepers, the blacksmith and his widowed sister, 2 older women from the chapel, and 3 ranch hands who had spent the afternoon lifting livestock onto the roof of a flooded barn. Margaret received every one of them at the abandoned kitchen. She counted each arrival with a piece of charcoal on the wall, not trusting memory once exhaustion began to blur the faces. 43 marks finally stood beside the hearth. The last boat brought no bodies, only bad news. The village bakery had collapsed, the flour store was underwater, and the southern pasture fence had broken. Cattle were moving with the flood toward the willow flats. Margaret looked around the kitchen. Wet clothes hung from nails. Boots steamed near the fire. Every bench and flour chest had become a bed. The miller breathed more evenly beneath 2 old horse blankets, but the water in the kettle was nearly gone. "Listen carefully," Margaret said. "No one drinks from the river. No one drinks from the lower wells. We boil every cup." A murmur passed through the room. "There isn't enough wood," someone said. "There's if we stop heating rooms no one is using." The steward, who had entered to record the estate laborers' hours, looked up sharply. "You have no authority over the house stores." Margaret faced him. "Then fetch someone who does." Nathaniel stood just beyond the doorway. He had removed his oilskin, and rain had darkened his shoulders. His gaze moved over the crowded room. The miller on the floor, the dripping coats, the villagers holding empty cups. "You may take wood from the old laundry shed," he said. "Nothing from the main house." Margaret nodded once. "And lamp oil." The steward opened his ledger. "That is estate property." "So is the shed," Margaret replied. "Write it down." Before midnight, the forgotten kitchen had become a machine built for emergency. One group split wood. Another scrubbed kettles with sand and ash. The blacksmith repaired the broken pump handle beside the kitchen yard, though the upper well produced barely enough water for cooking. Margaret tore linen from discarded curtains and marked each strip with a number. Those numbers became ration tokens, 1 for broth, 1 for bread when bread could be found, 1 for a cup of boiled water. No one received more because they were wealthy. No one received less because they rented land from Ashcombe. When the steward tried to move the estate tenants ahead of the shopkeepers, Margaret took the token basket from his hand. "In this room," she said, "hunger has no rank." His face reddened, but Nathaniel, standing near the cold doorway, did not contradict her. Margaret gave the first cup of broth to the miller. The second went to an older woman whose hands would not stop shaking. By the time the kettle emptied, Margaret had eaten nothing herself. She was washing cups when she found half a biscuit beneath a folded blanket. One of the rescued women had hidden it there. Margaret carried it back to her. "You may eat this." The woman closed her fingers around it, but did not raise it to her mouth. "For tomorrow," she whispered. Those 2 words frightened Margaret more than the river. People only hid food when they believed no more was coming. She crossed the room to an old oak cupboard she had noticed earlier, forced open its rusted latch, and found shelves lined with cracked jars, mouse-chewed sacks, and 1 locked tin box. Beneath it lay a small embroidered cloth, faded almost white. Margaret stopped. The cloth had belonged to her mother. She had carried it through 3 households, folding it beneath her clothes whenever she was moved from one position to another. That morning, the housekeeper had thrown Margaret's belongings into the abandoned kitchen after dismissing her from service. She had not realized the cloth had fallen from her trunk. For one quiet moment, she held it against her palm. Her mother had once kept a boarding house kitchen alive through a railroad strike, feeding men who paid late and women who could not pay at all. She had taught Margaret that a pantry was not measured by what it held, but by how wisely it was shared. Margaret folded the cloth and tied it around the handle of the ration basket. Then she asked for a hammer. The locked box contained no food. It held old kitchen inventories, delivery receipts, and faded plans of the estate grounds. Margaret spread them across a flower chest. One document showed 2 outdoor ovens near the orchard wall, abandoned when the main house installed a newer range. Another listed a smokehouse, a dairy cellar, and a grain-drying shed attached to the western granary. The blacksmith leaned over her shoulder. Those ovens still stand. Can they be made usable? With clay, stone, and dry timber. Margaret traced the road from the kitchen to the granaries. The flood could not reach any of it. Then at daylight, we build fires. The next morning revealed the full scale of their isolation. Water covered the road in both directions. The telegraph poles leaned across the current, and the railway embankment had washed away beyond the bend. No supply wagon could reach them. No flour could come from another town. But 3 dairy cows had survived on a rise near the flooded pasture, and 2 boats brought them uphill by leading them through the shallows. The villagers cheered when the animals reached the kitchen yard. Margaret assigned one woman to milk them, another to skim cream, and the miller, once strong enough to sit upright, to inspect the hand quern found in a storage room. Every task became part of the same promise. No one would wait helplessly for rescue. Nathaniel arrived while Margaret was organizing the oven crews. He placed a folded paper on the table. "A count of provisions in the main house," he said. "Salt tea, preserved meat, and enough flour for my household for 6 weeks." Margaret read it. And the granaries? They remained sealed. The room quieted. "There is wheat uphill while these people have hidden their last biscuit," she said. "The grain secures this estate's winter contracts. The flood has already destroyed the village mill. That does not transfer ownership." Margaret looked at the ration tokens hanging from her mother's cloth. "No," she said. "It transfers responsibility." His eyes hardened, but something behind the anger shifted. Before either could speak again, a ranch hand burst through the yard gate, mud to his waist. "The cattle broke through the willow flats," he gasped. "Most are gone, but we found 12 alive on Miller's Ridge." Margaret reached for the estate map. The man caught his breath and added, "There's something else." A body was tangled against the granary fence. Nathaniel went still. "Dead?" Margaret asked. "Alive when we pulled him free. Barely. Bring him here." The ranch hand hesitated. He had this tied under his coat. He placed a soaked leather pouch on the table. Inside lay a brass key stamped with the mark of Ashcombe's western granary. Nathaniel stared at it. Only 3 such keys existed. One hung from his own watch chain. One belonged to the steward, and the third had disappeared 8 years earlier with a tenant accused of stealing grain. From the yard came the groan of wagon wheels as the half-drowned stranger was carried toward the kitchen. The stranger arrived on a door torn from the flooded smithy, his boots dragging behind him and river mud packed into the seams of his coat. Margaret cleared the center table with one sweep of her arm. "Set him here." The man's face was cut along the temple, and one shoulder bent at an unnatural angle. He looked near 60, though cold and hunger had added years to him. His eyelids fluttered when Margaret pressed a warm cloth to his mouth. Nathaniel stood at the foot of the table, staring at the brass key in his hand. "His name is Elias Ward," he said at last. The kitchen grew still. Even Margaret knew that name. Elias had once rented Ashcombe land near the western boundary. 8 years earlier, he had been accused of breaking into the granary and stealing wheat during a poor harvest. He disappeared before trial, leaving behind a wife who later died in another county and a reputation the estate never allowed to soften. The steward entered behind the stretcher and stopped so abruptly that his ledger slipped from beneath his arm. "You," Elias whispered. The word barely carried over the fire. The steward recovered quickly. "He is delirious." Elias tried to lift one hand. His fingers closed around Margaret's wrist. "Not thief," he breathed. "Never was." Then his eyes rolled shut. Margaret looked toward Nathaniel. "Who accused him?" The steward answered first. The evidence was plain. Broken seal. Missing sacks. His boot prints in the drying shed. "And the third key?" Margaret asked. A pulse moved in the steward's jaw. Nathaniel placed the brass key on the table. It vanished the same night. The steward stepped closer. "Sir, this man should be taken to the stable loft. He is not safe among respectable people." Margaret covered Elias with a blanket. "He stays here. You have no idea what he may have done. I know what the river did to him." The steward turned to Nathaniel. "This kitchen is already beyond control." Nathaniel looked at Elias, then at the 43 charcoal marks on the wall. "He stays," he said. It was the first time he had chosen Margaret's judgment over his steward's. The decision cost him something. She could see that. Pride did not leave a man all at once. It loosened one finger at a time. By noon, the relief kitchen had spread beyond its walls. The orchard ovens were repaired with river clay and broken brick. Fires burned inside them, while women mixed coarse dough from the last household flour and meal ground by hand. Men carried water from the upper well in milk cans, and every container passed through Margaret's boiling station before it reached a cup. The ration tokens kept order. White cloth meant water. Blue thread meant broth. Red meant bread. Margaret cut the pieces small enough that no one could divide them and sell favors. Nathaniel watched her tie the day's tokens into bundles. "You expect theft," he said. "I expect fear. Is there a difference?" Fear takes what it thinks will vanish. Theft takes what belongs to another. His gaze moved to the western granary. "And which do you call opening a man's storehouse without consent?" Margaret met his eyes. "That depends on whether the man is watching people starve outside it." Before he could answer, the steward approached carrying an estate notice sealed in red wax. "Sir, I have drawn an order," he said. "It forbids entry into all granaries, storehouses, and contracted lands. With so many strangers wandering the property, we must protect your assets." Nathaniel read the paper. Margaret saw the hesitation before his face closed again. "Post it," he said. The steward nailed copies to the orchard gate, the dairy wall, and the granary doors. By afternoon, every hungry person on the hill could read the same message. The grain was protected. The people were not. No one challenged it openly. Tenants lowered their eyes when the steward passed. Shopkeepers spoke only in the kitchen, never in the yard. The villagers knew Ashcombe owned their leases, their grazing rights, and in some cases the debts secured against their tools. Gratitude for rescue did not erase the habit of obedience. Margaret understood then that the flood was not the only thing holding them captive. She needed more than anger. She needed proof that the locked grain could be used without destroying the estate, and proof that someone had lied about it before. Elias woke near sunset. He swallowed 2 spoonfuls of broth, then pushed the third away. "The key," he said. Margaret held it where he could see. His eyes filled, though he did not weep. "Thought the river took it." "Why did you have it?" "Because it was mine." Nathaniel stepped from the shadows near the hearth. No tenant was ever issued a granary key. Elias turned his head. "Your father issued one." Nathaniel's expression changed. Elias spoke in broken phrases, stopping often to breathe. In the year of the failed harvest, Nathaniel's father had quietly allowed grain to be distributed to tenants through the western drying shed. He feared public knowledge would anger his creditors. So he gave Elias a key, and instructed him to keep a private tally of every sack. The steward's predecessor had managed the records. The present steward had been his clerk. One night, Elias said, looking toward the man by the door, "They moved 20 sacks. Blame me before morning." The steward laughed once softly. A convenient story after 8 years. Elias fumbled beneath his shirt and drew out a cord. A small iron tag hung from it, stamped with the number 17. Margaret recognized the mark from the old inventories in the locked tin box. She spread the kitchen records across the table. Page after page listed deliveries to the main house and western shed. Besides, several entries appeared the same number. 17. "What does it mean?" Nathaniel asked. "Storage lot," Elias said. "Every sack from that lot had blue twine." Margaret found the final entry. 20 sacks were recorded as spoiled and burned. No witness signature appeared beneath the note. The steward reached for the ledger. Margaret closed it first. "If they were burned," she said, "there should be ash records, card hours, or payment for hauling." "There are gaps in old books," he replied. "There are always gaps where someone hopes no one will look." The steward leaned toward Nathaniel. His voice remained respectful, which made it more dangerous. "Sir, this woman is encouraging servants and tenants to inspect private records. You risk disorder at the very moment discipline is needed." Margaret stepped between him and the table. "Discipline is not the same as silence." Nathaniel looked from the ledger to Elias. "What happened to the grain?" Elias's voice weakened. "Sold east. Cash never entered estate books." The steward's face did not change. That frightened Margaret more than outrage would have. Nathaniel closed the ledger. "No one leaves the kitchen tonight." The steward raised an eyebrow. "Am I confined?" "You are asked to remain available." "By whom?" Nathaniel's answer came slowly. "By the owner of this estate." For the first time, the steward bowed without confidence. The next morning, the water rose another foot around the village roofs. A rescue boat returned from the chapel carrying soaked hymnals, a broken medicine chest, and news that the eastern embankment had failed. The flood would not recede soon. Margaret recalculated the food. At the current ration, the household flour would last 2 days. The dairy cows produced too little milk for 43 adults. The rescued cattle could not be slaughtered immediately without wasting meat they lacked salt to preserve. The western granary held the only practical answer. Margaret carried the ration basket to the granary yard and stood before the posted notice. Villagers gathered behind her, though most remained several steps away. Nathaniel arrived with the steward and 2 estate hands. Margaret held up a strip of red cloth. "This token is today's bread ration," she said. "After tomorrow, it represents nothing." Nathaniel looked at the granary door. The steward spoke quietly beside him. "Your contracts are legally binding. Open that grain, and buyers may claim breach. The estate could lose its credit." "And if we keep it sealed?" Margaret asked. The steward turned to her. "The village must endure until the roads reopen." "On what?" "That is not the estate's legal responsibility." The blacksmith shifted among the villagers. He opened his mouth, then closed it when the steward looked his way. Fear passed through the crowd like a shadow. Margaret did not ask them to become brave. Not yet. She turned to Nathaniel. "You have enough grain to fulfill every written contract and still feed these people for 12 days. I checked the old drying records and the current bin measurements." The steward's polite mask cracked. "You entered the granary?" "No. I measured the exterior, compared capacity with the inventories, and accounted for spoilage." Nathaniel almost smiled, but the expression vanished under the weight of the choice. "You cannot guarantee the flood will fall in 12 days, he said. "No. You cannot guarantee another buyer will extend mercy." "No. You cannot guarantee this estate survives if I open those doors." Margaret's voice softened. "No. I can only tell you what will happen if you do not." Behind them, the woman who had hidden the biscuits stepped forward. She still carried it wrapped in cloth. "I kept this for tomorrow," she said, "but there are too many tomorrows now." She placed the biscuit on the ground between Nathaniel and the granary. No speech followed. None was needed. Nathaniel reached for the key on his watch chain. The steward moved quickly, catching his wrist. "Think carefully, sir." Every person in the yard saw it. The grip. The presumption. The moment when a servant forgot whose hand he was holding. Nathaniel looked down at the fingers around his wrist. "Release me." The steward obeyed, but his eyes had gone cold. Nathaniel inserted the key into the western granary door. It would not turn. He tried again. The lock had been changed. The steward stepped back, a sensible precaution during disorder. Nathaniel faced him. "Who authorized it?" "I acted to preserve your property." "You acted to prevent my access." The estate hands moved uncertainly. One looked toward the steward, the other toward Nathaniel. Margaret understood, then, that the steward's power did not come from a ledger alone. He controlled wages, supply orders, tenancy reports, and debts. He had spent years making himself the gate through which every decision passed. His goal was simple. He wanted the grain sealed until hunger made the village obedient. Because desperate tenants could be forced to sign away land, labor, and silence. Nathaniel stepped in front of the granary door. "No one under my protection goes hungry while food stands behind me." The steward's mouth tightened. "You may regret saying that before witnesses." "I regret not saying it sooner." Nathaniel turned to the blacksmith. "Break the lock." The blacksmith looked at the steward. His courage nearly failed. Then he saw the biscuit on the ground and lifted his hammer. The first blow bent the iron plate. The second split the latch. At the third, the door opened, and the smell of dry wheat rolled into the yard. People did not cheer. Hunger had made them too careful for that. Margaret took the first sack only after recording its weight in both the estate ledger and her kitchen tally. Nathaniel signed beside the entry. Then he handed the pencil to the miller. 3 records, 3 witnesses. No one would later call mercy theft. As the grain moved toward the orchard ovens, Margaret noticed the steward walking away from the yard. "Where are you going?" Nathaniel called. "To secure the eastern storehouse." Margaret looked at Elias's brass key in her palm. Then she saw smoke rising beyond the dairy wall. Not from the ovens. From the estate record room. Someone had set fire to the books that could prove where the missing grain had gone. Margaret ran toward the record room before Nathaniel could stop her. Smoke pushed beneath the door in thick black ribbons. One window had already cracked from the heat, and flames moved behind the glass where estate ledgers were stacked from floor to ceiling. "Buckets," she shouted. "Form a line from the upper well." The villagers did not wait for rank or permission. Tin pails, milk cans, wash basins, and cooking pots moved hand to hand across the yard. Nathaniel tore off his coat and wrapped it around his arm. The blacksmith struck the door latch with his hammer until the wood split inward. Fire rolled across the ceiling. Margaret dropped low and crawled inside. The heat struck like an open furnace. Burning paper lifted around her in white fragments before turning black. Shelves along the east wall had collapsed, but the iron document chest beside Nathaniel's father's desk was still closed. She reached for it. A beam cracked overhead. Nathaniel caught the back of her dress and pulled her away as the burning timber fell where her shoulders had been. "The chest," she coughed. They seized its handles together. The iron box was heavier than grain and hot enough to burn through cloth. Behind them, the flames reached the western shelves. Then Margaret saw the steward. He stood at the rear window outside, one hand on the frame and the other holding a bottle wrapped in oil-soaked rag. Their eyes met through the smoke. He did not look surprised. He threw the bottle. Nathaniel turned as it struck the floor. Fire burst between them and the doorway. The chest dropped from Margaret's hands. The flames cut off their escape. Outside, villagers shouted. Someone began breaking the stone sill beneath the rear window. The opening was narrow, built for air rather than passage. Nathaniel dragged the iron chest toward it. "You first," he said. Margaret shook her head. "The records. If that roof falls, there will be no one left to read them." A burning ledger struck the floor beside her. She kicked it away, then saw several loose pages trapped beneath the desk, protected from flame by the fallen chair. Blue twine lay across one sheet. Lot 17. Margaret snatched the pages and pushed them inside her dress. The rear wall shuddered as the blacksmith's hammer broke through mortar. Nathaniel lifted Margaret toward the opening. She squeezed through jagged stone, cutting both forearms. Hands caught her outside. Then the villagers reached in for the chest. The roof gave a low, deep groan. Nathaniel was still inside. Margaret dropped to her knees at the opening. "Nathaniel!" His hand appeared through the smoke, then vanished. The blacksmith reached in up to his shoulder. The miller, still weak but standing, braced him around the waist. Together they caught Nathaniel's wrist and pulled as the roof collapsed behind him. He struck the ground beside Margaret, his hair singed and one side of his face black with soot. For a few seconds he did not breathe. Margaret pressed both hands to his chest. "Do not leave me with your granaries," she said. Nathaniel coughed hard enough to turn onto his side. The relief that moved through her was so sharp she had to look away. The fire consumed the record room, but it did not spread to the granaries. The villagers soaked the adjoining walls while smoke drifted over the hill. By dawn, only stone and twisted shelving remained. The steward was gone. So was the east pasture horse. Nathaniel sat at the kitchen table with his ribs bound and his burned hand wrapped in linen. The iron chest rested before him. Its lock had warped in the heat, but the blacksmith opened it with a cold chisel. Inside were mortgage notes, tenant agreements, tax receipts, and letters written in Nathaniel's father's hand. Most had survived. The pages Margaret rescued were less fortunate. Their edges were burned, and water had blurred part of the ink. Still, the number 17 remained visible, along with dates and quantities that matched the old kitchen inventory. Elias studied them from his cot. "That is the lot," he said. 20 sacks moved east. Nathaniel searched the chest until he found a narrow packet sealed with his father's ring. The letter inside was never sent. It instructed the steward's predecessor to distribute emergency grain to tenants, record every sack, and accept repayment only after the following harvest. At the bottom, Nathaniel's father had written one final line. "No family shall lose land for bread taken in hunger." Nathaniel read it twice. "My father knew." "He tried to make it right," Margaret said. "He hid it." "Yes." The answer wounded him because it was true. A rider arrived before noon from the county seat. The flood had damaged the northern road, but the courthouse remained accessible by the high ridge. The steward had reached town first. He had sworn that Nathaniel was injured, that strangers had broken into the granary, and that Margaret had led an organized theft. A county deputy was coming to arrest her. Nathaniel pushed back from the table. "Then we go to court before he comes here. You can barely stand. I can sign my own name." Elias tried to rise from the cot and nearly fell. Margaret steadied him. "You are not fit to ride. If I stay, he wins." The words were simple, but everyone in the kitchen understood their weight. 8 years earlier, fear had driven Elias from the county. If he fled again, the steward would turn absence into guilt a second time. They left by the ridge road in 2 wagons. Nathaniel rode in the first beside Margaret, one hand pressed to his ribs. The iron chest was chained beneath the seat. Elias lay in the second wagon under blankets, guarded by the blacksmith and the miller. The flood moved below them through fields, streets, and ruined fences. On higher ground, cattle stood packed together beneath oak trees. No one spoke until they reached the old timber bridge across Dry Creek. Halfway over, the lead wagon stopped. The center planks had been cut. Margaret climbed down. Fresh saw marks showed beneath the mud. The steward had reached the bridge before them. "We can turn east," the blacksmith said. "Add 6 hours." "The hearing may be over by then," Nathaniel replied. Margaret studied the missing section. The gap was wide enough to break a wheel, but not a horse's stride. "Unload the chest," she said. They carried it across by hand, walking the narrow outer beam one person at a time. Then they removed the wagon wheels, rolled them over the intact rail, and pulled the frame across with ropes. Elias had to be carried. At the center of the bridge, his courage failed. He looked down at the floodwater and froze in the blacksmith's arms. "I cannot," he whispered. Margaret stepped onto the beam beside him. "You crossed 8 years to reach this day," she said. "Do not stop over 12 feet of water." He looked at her, then toward Nathaniel waiting on the far bank. The steward had warned him that Ashcombe blood would always choose property over truth. Nathaniel removed his hat. "Mr. Ward," he said, "I cannot undo what was done to you, but I will stand beside you when you name it." Elias closed his eyes once. Then he let the blacksmith carry him across. They reached the county courthouse after the hearing had begun. Every bench was filled. Farmers stood against the walls, and merchants crowded the rear doorway. The steward sat beside the county attorney in a clean gray coat, as though smoke had never touched him. A deputy moved toward Margaret the moment she entered. "Margaret Hale?" Nathaniel stepped between them. "She is under my protection." The judge looked down from the bench. "Mr. Ashcombe, the complaint bears your estate seal." Nathaniel turned toward the steward. The steward offered a sorrowful expression. "Your judgment has been affected by injury, sir. I acted to preserve the estate as my position required." The county attorney placed several papers before the judge. They included the posted order forbidding entry into the granaries, a sworn inventory of contracted grain, and a statement accusing Margaret of inciting tenants to seize private property. The estate seal appeared at the bottom. The judge examined it carefully. "This is a valid impression." Nathaniel's voice stayed controlled. "I did not authorize that complaint. Your steward claims delegated authority. He had authority to manage accounts, not accuse innocent people in my name." The steward rose. "With respect, Your Honor, Mr. Ashcombe opened contracted stores under pressure from frightened tenants and this woman. When I attempted to protect his assets, they destroyed the lock. Later, the record room burned. Miss Hale emerged carrying documents." A murmur spread through the courtroom. The deputy moved closer to Margaret. For one terrible moment, the official paper looked stronger than every person who had survived the flood. The judge turned to her. "Did you remove records from the burning building?" "Yes." "Did you encourage the granary to be opened?" "Yes." "Did you possess written authority?" "No." The steward lowered his eyes modestly, as though the case had already ended. The judge sighed. "Then the law places you in a difficult position." Nathaniel gripped the rail. "The grain was mine to release." "That may answer the theft," the judge said. "It does not answer destruction of estate records or conspiracy against your steward." Margaret opened the iron chest. "We did not destroy the records," she said. "He tried to." The burned pages were placed before the court. The ink was smeared. One corner had been lost entirely. The county attorney frowned. "These scraps prove nothing." "They prove Lot 17 existed," Margaret said. "They show 20 sacks listed as spoiled, though no hauling cost, witness signature, or ash record appears." The steward smiled faintly. "Old books are often incomplete." Elias was called. He walked slowly to the witness chair with one arm tied against his chest. When he saw the steward, his face emptied of color. The clerk asked his name. No answer came. The steward leaned back and watched him. 8 years of accusation returned to Elias at once. The missing key, the empty house, the county road taken in darkness, the knowledge that every respectable man had believed the ledger instead of him. "Mr. Ward," the judge said, "do you understand that you are under oath?" Elias looked toward the door. He nearly stood. Then he saw the villagers from the relief kitchen entering the courtroom. The woman who had hidden the biscuit stood first. Behind her came the miller, the blacksmith, the shopkeepers, ranch hands, and older women from the chapel. They had followed on horseback and by wagon. No one spoke. They simply remained. Elias looked at Nathaniel's bandaged hand, then at Margaret's cut arms. "Yes," he said, "I understand." His testimony came slowly. He described the private grain distributions ordered by Nathaniel's father, the tally he kept, and the night 20 sacks disappeared. He named the clerk who watched the doors and later accused him. The steward. The county attorney attacked the story. "After 8 years, you expect this court to trust memory over sealed records?" "No," Elias replied. "I expect it to trust the man who made the seal." Nathaniel placed his father's unsent letter before the judge. The ring impression matched the estate's seal on the complaint. The judge compared them. The steward's confidence returned. "Of course they match. Both came from the Ashcombe office." Margaret watched the judge turn the complaint toward the window. Then she saw it. The estate seal showed a small break along the wheat sheaf at its center. The letter's seal did not. Margaret asked permission to examine both. "The ring was damaged in the record room fire," the steward said quickly. "That explains the difference." Nathaniel shook his head. "The ring used on my father's letter is in the iron chest. It has not been worn in 15 years. Margaret looked at the steward's right hand. A trace of red wax remained beneath his thumbnail. "The complaint was sealed yesterday," she said, "before the fire." The courtroom went quiet. The judge examined the mark again. The broken wheat sheaf on the complaint matched the seal used on the posted granary orders. It did not match the historic estate ring. The steward had commissioned a duplicate seal. Still, the judge hesitated. "A false seal proves unauthorized documents," he said. "It does not prove the missing grain was sold." The case almost failed there. The records that might have shown payment had burned. Then the county clerk, a nervous man seated beside the judge, shifted in his chair. Margaret noticed him looking at the steward. The steward noticed too. "You have already certified the complaint," he said softly. "Best remember what that certification means." The clerk's mouth closed. The judge turned to him. "Do you have information for this court?" He shook his head. The deputy moved toward Margaret again. Then the woman with the hidden biscuit stepped forward from the gallery. "Your Honor," she said, "that clerk was at the East Freight office 8 years ago." The clerk stared at her. She continued, "My husband hauled wheat before he died. He told me the clerk wrote the shipping number because the steward paid extra for silence." The judge ordered the clerk to the witness chair. His hands shook as he took the oath. At first, he claimed he remembered nothing. The steward looked directly at him. The clerk's voice failed. He almost stepped down. Then Elias removed the iron tag from his neck and placed it on the rail. 17. The clerk stared at the number. "I wrote the freight receipt," he whispered. The steward stood. "You will ruin yourself." The clerk looked at him once, fear plain in his face. Then he faced the judge. 20 sacks went east under a false spoilage entry. The money was paid to him. He made me certify the loss. "Where is the receipt?" the judge asked. The clerk swallowed. "In the county freight archive, filed under lot 17. A deputy was sent across the square. The receipt returned within minutes. It bore the date, weight, destination, and the steward's signature. The payment matched no deposit in the estate books. The lie did not collapse loudly. It broke one piece at a time. The false seal. The changed granary lock. The burned record room. The missing grain. The attempt to stop the wagons at the bridge. At last, the judge ordered the steward taken into custody for fraud, arson, false swearing, and attempted destruction of evidence. He looked toward Nathaniel as the deputy approached. "I preserved your estate." Nathaniel stood despite the pain in his ribs. "No, you preserved your control over it." The steward's gaze shifted to Margaret. She did not look away. When the verdict was entered, the court recognized Nathaniel's authority to release the grain, dismissed every complaint against Margaret and the villagers, cleared Elias Ward's name, and ordered the old theft record corrected. Outside, the church bell rang over the flooded county. The villagers gathered on the courthouse steps, but Margaret remained inside beside the iron chest. Nathaniel came to her slowly. "You saved the records," he said. "No, people did." He looked toward Elias, who stood beneath his own name written cleanly in the court register for the first time in 8 years. Then Nathaniel placed the granary keys in Margaret's hand. "Keep them until the village is fed." She closed her fingers around the brass. Trust had come late, but it had come through fire, flood, and a door finally opened. The flood did not leave quickly. For 11 more days, brown water covered the lower road, and the abandoned kitchen remained the only place on the hill where no one asked who owned the chair before sitting in it. The western granary supplied measured sacks of wheat. The orchard ovens burned from before dawn until after dark. Every loaf was entered in Margaret's tally, every cup of broth marked by a token, and every delivery boat returned with a written count of the adults still sheltering on high ground. Nathaniel kept his promise. He opened the bean stores, the smokehouse, and the estate salt bins. He released timber for repairing boats and ordered his remaining horses used to move supplies instead of protecting ornamental fields. Whenever a steward's decision was required, he brought the question to the kitchen table. At first, Margaret believed this was temporary. Men often became generous under the eyes of witnesses, then returned to themselves once the danger passed. So she watched him. She watched when a contracted grain buyer arrived by the northern ridge and threatened legal action. Nathaniel did not hide behind the flood or blame the villagers. He showed the man the ration ledgers and accepted the financial loss in his own name. She watched when tenants came forward with old debts the former steward had inflated. Nathaniel opened every account and invited Elias to sit beside him while the figures were checked. She watched when the main house cook complained that villagers had worn mud across the estate linens. Nathaniel answered by carrying a stack of clean blankets down to the kitchen himself. None of it erased what he had once believed. But day after day, he chose differently. When the water finally began to fall, the village emerged slowly. Roof lines became houses again. The chapel steps appeared beneath the mud. Men recovered tools from workshops filled with silt, while women laid soaked account books and hymnals in the sun. The old mill could not be saved. Neither could the bakery. Nathaniel offered timber and stone, but Margaret refused to let rebuilding become charity that could later be used as leverage. At the kitchen table, she helped the villagers form a common recovery account. The estate supplied grain at cost. The blacksmith contributed labor. Shopkeepers recorded what each household could repay after the next harvest. The same ration tokens that had once promised 1 cup of water became proof of work and shares in the new communal mill. Margaret's mother's faded cloth remained tied around the basket handle. By autumn, the basket no longer carried emergency rations. It held receipts, meal schedules, and keys. There were now 4 keys to the western granary. Nathaniel kept one. Margaret held one. The miller held one. The 4th hung in the village meeting room, sealed behind glass, so no single person could ever again lock away food while others went hungry. Elias Ward did not leave after his name was cleared. Nathaniel offered him back the acreage he had once rented, along with repayment for the grain theft falsely laid upon him. Elias accepted the land, but refused the money. "Put it into the mill," he said. "Let the truth earn bread." He became keeper of the communal stores, a position chosen by vote rather than inheritance. Each month, he read the grain count aloud before the village. The first few times, his voice trembled when he reached Lot 17. In time, it did not. Yet not every wound receded with the water. The woman who had hidden the biscuit continued saving food beneath her blanket. Even after the ovens produced more bread than the kitchen needed, Margaret found crusts wrapped in cloth behind a loose stone in the wall. She never scolded her. Each morning, Margaret replaced the hardened crust with a fresh roll and left it in the same place. Weeks passed before the woman stopped hiding 2 pieces. Months passed before she stopped hiding 1. The first night she ate the whole loaf at the table. She did not announce it. She only brushed the crumbs into her palm, looked at Margaret, and smiled. Margaret still carried a fear of her own. Whenever heavy rain struck the windows, she woke before dawn and walked down to the lower steps. She checked the hitching post, the boat ropes, and the height of the river, though the repaired village now had warning markers and raised supply sheds. One morning, Nathaniel found her there in the rain. "You do not have to keep watch alone," he said. "I am not certain I know how to stop." He stood beside her without offering easy comfort. "Then I will learn the watch with you." That was how trust settled between them, not as forgiveness spoken once, but as work repeated until doubt had less room to live. Nathaniel never asked Margaret to return to her old place as a companion. Instead, he offered her formal authority over the estate provisions, tenant accounts, and relief stores. She accepted only after the agreement was written plainly and witnessed by the village council. Years later, the abandoned kitchen was no longer abandoned. Its chimney was rebuilt. Long tables filled the room. The orchard oven supplied bread to the rebuilt village and travelers stranded by winter storms. A brass plaque beside the door carried no family crest. It read, "Food stored here serves life first." The manner changed with it. Tenancy agreements became shorter and fairer. Storehouse counts were read publicly. No debt could be increased without 2 signatures, and no emergency provisions could be sealed by one person alone. Nathaniel aged into a quieter man than the one who had ridden down in an oilskin and called desperate neighbors trespassers. Margaret's hair silvered, but she remained slender, straight-backed, and exact with every ledger. Some evenings, they sat outside the kitchen while the village bell marked the hour. Neither spoke much of love. They had built too much of it to require the word. Long after the Great Flood became a story told beside warm stoves, travelers still heard about the broken skiff that struck the estate's lower steps. They heard how one dismissed woman opened a ruined kitchen before anyone gave her permission, and how a proud man learned that ownership without responsibility was only another kind of poverty. The old boat was eventually raised from the mud and repaired. It hung above the kitchen door, its split bow still visible. Beneath it, the door remained unlocked whenever storms came. If this story reminded you that mercy means little until it costs something, write "open the door" in the comments and tell us where you're watching from. Subscribe for more frontier stories where courage is measured by who receives shelter when the water rises.